Welcome to this deep dive, and this one's a real thriller, the Denver Strangler case, going back to the late 1800s to
Wow.
Denver. It was a booming city, but like any city, it had its dark side. We're talking three women murdered within 10 weeks, all strangled, all connected to the red light district, and the killer was never caught. So we're going to look into the victims, the suspects, and try to piece together what happened.
Yeah, it's like a cold case, from over a century ago. But the details are so vivid, so chilling that, it still feels relevant today. We're going to be looking at original newspaper accounts, court transcripts, even some reports from psychics who claim to have insights into the killer.
Psychics. Okay, that's definitely adding to the intrigue.
Yeah.
But let's start with the facts. Our three confirmed victims are Lena Tapper, Marie Konaswai, and Kiko Wayama. All of them worked as prostitutes in Denver. And there's a possible connection to this secret society called the Macaro, which had the whole other layer to this story.
Yeah, the Macro were kind of like a guild, but for prostitution. They had their own hierarchy, their own rules, even rituals, and their influence in Denver's underworld was significant. It's no coincidence that a lot of the key players in this case, both victims and suspects, had ties to this organization.
I'm looking at the details of Lena Tapper's murder, and it's brutal. She was found strangled in her own bed, and her lover, Richard DeMady, immediately became a suspect.
Especially since Dimity, who was also connected to the Macro, had been making advances towards another victim, Marie Contaswai. The police clearly saw a pattern there.
And Kontasway's murder is even more disturbing. The reports describe her being strangled with a cord so tight it cut into her flesh. But unlike the other victims, she was known to have quite a bit of money, and a large sum was missing from her belongings.
That detail is particularly intriguing because it points to a possible motive beyond just the violence that we see in the other murders. It suggests the killer may have been motivated by financial gain, potentially challenging the theory of a purely sadistic individual.
So we've got a potential robbery motive, a secret society, and a jealous lover as a suspect. This is already sounding like a classic mystery novel.
And we haven't even gotten to Kiku Oyama yet. She was a Japanese immigrant, also working as a prostitute, and her murder is perhaps the most unsettling of all.
I'm reading her lover, Imi's, account, and it's heartbreaking. She was last seen drawing her curtains for the night, seemingly safe in her own home. But when Imi returned from a walk, he found her gasping for air with a towel wrapped tightly around her neck. Despite attempts to save her, she died from strangulation.
And the crime scene itself had signs of a struggle. The bed sheets were disturbed, there were bloodstains, a damp towel, and her drawers had been ransacked. But what's really odd is that the keys to both the front and back doors were missing.
That's strange. It almost suggests the killer planned this, knowing how they would enter and escape.
Exactly. The missing keys add a layer of premeditation to the crime, making it even more chilling.
All right, so we have three brutal murders, each with its own set of disturbing details. But let's focus on Richard DeMady for a moment. He was Lena Tapper's lover, he had connections to the Macaro, and he'd been showing interest in another victim. Seems like a pretty solid suspect, right?
He was definitely the prime suspect. The police charged him with Tapper's murder, and the public was convinced of his guilt. The trial itself became a huge media event with everyone in Denver following the proceedings.
I'm looking at the court transcripts now, and the description of DeMady's sister's outburst is truly chilling. She apparently had some sort of mental breakdown in the courtroom, claiming to see the victim's ghosts. It must have been a tense and chaotic scene.
Absolutely. And remember, this was a time when spiritualism and the occult were gaining popularity. So for many people, DeMady's sister's claims would have added to the sense that this case was steeped in something dark and supernatural.
On top of that, there were rumors of eyewitnesses placing DeMady at the scene of the crime. And the prosecution even claimed to have proof that he had bribed a judge to secure his release earlier in the case.
The prosecution was confident they had their man.
You're probably thinking, okay, we have a prime suspect, case closed, right? Well, not so fast. This is where things get really interesting. Dimity was acquitted.
Despite the public outcry and the prosecution's seemingly strong case, the jury found him not guilty.
Wow. So what happened then?
Well, immediately after his acquittal, Dimity disappeared. He fled to Brazil, leaving behind a cloud of suspicion that would follow him for the rest of his life.
So Dimity escapes to Brazil and leaves everyone wondering, was he innocent or just a very lucky man? But the story doesn't end there, right?
No, not at all. In fact, Dimiti's acquittal only seemed to intensify the search for the Denver Strangler. The police were under huge pressure to solve these crimes, especially with the public on edge.
Which brings us to our next suspect, Frank Rolich. From what I'm reading, he was this French-Canadian laborer who had a bit of a reputation as a troublemaker. And wouldn't know it, he fit the description of a man seen running from Kiku Oyama's house after her murder. Plus, there were these rumors about him being involved with the back row.
Yeah, Roglic definitely fit the profile of someone the police were looking for, connected to the underworld, potentially violent, and maybe even had a grudge against the victims. But like a lot of the suspects in this case, solid evidence was really hard to find.
It seems like Roglic was aware of all the eyes on him. I'm reading this account of him actually going to the police station, offering to be searched and questioned. He even gave an alibi for the night of Oyama's murder, saying he was out drinking with friends.
It was a pretty bold move, almost like he was trying a little too hard to prove his innocence. But the police, even with their suspicions, couldn't definitively link him to the crime. So Roglic, like Demody, was released, and the authorities were back to square one.
It's fascinating how this case, even back then, played out in the newspapers. You can almost picture people reading the headlines and gossiping about the latest suspect. I wonder if all this media attention had any impact on the investigation.
It's certainly possible. We have to remember that this was way before forensic science as we know it. Investigations relied a lot on eyewitness accounts, circumstantial evidence, and, a lot of times, public pressure.
Which brings us to H. Miller, a man who definitely had a violent side. I'm reading about this incident where he attacked a woman named Marie Vondre, and the details are, well, pretty disturbing.
Maller's case is interesting because it makes you wonder about violence in general, and if the police were maybe too quick to dismiss some acts as not connected to the Strangler.
So tell me about this attack on Marie Vondre. What happened?
Well, from what I've gathered, Meller tried to strangle Vondre, but she fought back and managed to call for help from a nearby police officer. When the officer got there, Meller was apparently about to cut her throat with a razor.
That's terrifying. And it sounds really similar to the Strangler's way of doing things.
You'd think so, right? But even with the similarities, the police chief at the time didn't believe Meller was the Strangler. He thought the attack was just Meller's hot temper, not part of a, deliberate pattern of violence.
But if he wasn't the Strangler, why was his attack so similar? It seems like a huge coincidence.
That's the question, isn't it? It's possible that Meller's attack was a one-time thing, just a moment of rage. But it's also possible that the police, feeling all this pressure to find the Strangler, were focused on a very specific kind of killer, someone methodical, deliberate, and maybe a stranger to the victims. Meller, with his history of violence and connection to Vondres, didn't really fit that image.
So are you saying that the police might have accidentally narrowed their focus, overlooking potential suspects who didn't fit their idea of the Strangler?
It's definitely something to think about. We see this a lot in criminal investigations where tunnel vision can lead to missed opportunities and unexplored leads.
This whole case seems to be full of missed opportunities and near misses. It's almost like the Strangler was always a step ahead.
And just when they thought they were closing in, another suspect would pop up and make everything more complicated.
Which leads us to Victor Monchereau, a French carpenter with, and I'm quoting the newspaper here, abnormally large hands. Now, why would they even mention that?
It seems like they were really grasping at straws at this point, looking for any little detail that might connect a suspect to the crimes. In this case, they were fixated on the idea that the Strangler must have had powerful hands to overpower his victims.
So how did Monchereau become a suspect to begin with?
Well, it all started with a drunken confession. One of Monchereau's former friends, Alphonse Lemaire, went on this rambling rant in a saloon, claiming that Monchereau was the Denver Strangler.
Another saloon confession. Seems like half of this case happened in saloons. But what exactly did Lemaire say?
According to him, Monchereau used chloroform to knock out his victims before strangling them and robbing them. He even described Monchereau's plan to kill another woman, but said that Monchereau got scared and ran off before he could do it.
Wait, so they almost caught him red-handed?
According to Lemaire, yes. But of course, we can't take his word as gospel. He was pretty drunk at the time.
And what did Monchereau say about all of this?
He denied everything. In fact, he turned things around and accused Lemaire of being the real killer, saying that Lemaire was the violent one and had a reason to frame him.
So it's another he said situation. How frustrating. Did the police believe either of them?
They didn't really believe either one, seeing them both as unreliable, maybe even manipulated by the macro. They thought the organization might have been trying to protect its own by putting forward these fake confessions.
So even the police thought the macro might be pulling the strings. That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is, but it shows how much distrust and suspicion there was in this case. The police were convinced that someone knew the truth about the Denver Strangler, but that there was a code of silence preventing them from figuring it out.
It's like running into a wall every time they got close to the truth.
Exactly. And it wasn't just Lemaire and Monchereau. There was even this black hod carrier who said he overheard a confession in a saloon, but couldn't say who was talking.
It seems like everyone in Denver was hearing confessions in saloons back then. But seriously, all these dead ends must have been so frustrating for the investigators.
You can imagine the pressure they were under. The longer it went unsolved, the more the public's fear and anxiety grew. The Denver Strangler was more than just a killer. He represented the dark side of the city, a reminder that even in a booming place like Denver, danger was lurking everywhere.
It's like the Denver Strangler just disappeared. We've looked at all these suspects, and they all have some connection to the victims and the macro, but none of them were ever really proven to be the killer. So where does that leave us?
It's a question that's bothered people for over 100 years. Was the Denver Strangler just really good at tricking everyone, or was there something else going on?
Like what? A big conspiracy. The police
Yeah.
messed up. Or just bad luck.
Could be any of those, or maybe all of them together. But one thing people forget about these old cases is how much anxiety there was in society back then. Denver was growing like crazy, with people coming from all over the world, and that brought clashes of cultures and values and all that.
And the Strangler case just fed into those anxieties, didn't it? He became the symbol of the city's dark side, this
Yeah.
scary figure hiding in the shadows, preying on women who were already kind of pushed to the edges of society.
Exactly. And because most of the victims were prostitutes, there was a certain lack of concern, even from some in law enforcement. I found this newspaper article from back then that called Lena Tapper Unchaste, as if her lifestyle meant she deserved less justice, which is awful.
It shows how people's prejudices back then could really affect things, even how justice was served. These women were victims, plain and simple.
Absolutely. And I think we have to consider the macro's role in all of this. They weren't just in the background, they were really tied into the lives of the victims and a lot of the suspects.
That's an interesting idea.
Mm.
But if they were so powerful, why couldn't they protect their own people from becoming victims? Doesn't that seem contradictory?
Right. And that's what makes this case so interesting. There's so much mystery, so many unanswered questions. Were the macro protecting someone? Or were they just trying to stay in control while everything was falling apart?
We may never know. But it's clear that they made this case even harder to solve for the police.
There were rumors about secret rituals, coded messages, and this strict rule of silence among members. It was like trying to solve a puzzle without all the pieces.
I'm looking at the information about Julia Vogt and Mabel Brown, and it's scary to think that they might be connected to the Strangler. Vogt, the clairvoyant, said she got a description of the killer from spirits while in a trance. And then, years later, she was found strangled in her apartment.
And then there's Mabel Brown, murdered in 1903, almost 10 years after the first three victims. Her case is so similar to the other stranglings that a lot of people think the Denver Strangler came back.
But if it was the same killer, why wait so long between murders? And why target these two women in particular?
Those are the questions that still puzzle researchers. Some people think Vogt was targeted because she said she knew something about the killer. As for Brown, her connection to the case is less clear, but the way she was killed is too similar to ignore.
It's like the Strangler was playing games with the police, reminding them that he was still out there.
It's a chilling thought, and it shows how powerful this case still is. The Denver Strangler might be gone, but his story still fascinates and horrifies us. It reminds us that some mysteries just stay unsolved.
So what have we learned from this deep dive into the Denver Strangler case? What's the takeaway?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that history is messy. There are always more questions than answers, and even when you investigate something thoroughly, you might still be left with some uncertainty.
It reminds us to be skeptical, to question what we think we know, and to admit that we don't know everything. We may never know for sure who the Denver Strangler was or why he did it. But by looking into the case, by examining the evidence and the context, we get a better understanding of not only the past, but also ourselves.
And maybe that's the real point of all this. It's not just about solving a mystery, it's about engaging with history and seeing how complex it really is. It's recognizing that the past is still affecting us today in ways we might not even realize.
Well said. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey into the dark side of Denver's past. We encourage you to keep learning, keep asking questions, and share your own thoughts about this mystery.
Until next time.
Keep searching for the truth.